welcome to Highly Informed. I'm your host, Shaun Salvaje. Highly Informed is all about entheogenic education and news you can use when it comes to the world of cannabis and psychedelics. We are shooting our first episode ever right now. It's South by Southwest, and I'm really excited to be here with Ricardo Baca. Ricardo is joining us all the way from Colorado.
Yeah.
I know Grasslands is based in Colorado. You're in Colorado too.
Yeah, exactly.
So Ricardo's coming all the way from Colorado, and he is here to help me open up a conversation that I'm really excited to have. For those of you who don't know me, I'm actually a retired military photojournalist, and I got into cannabis first through the lens of story. So I'm really happy to share this with you, Ricardo, to have this moment, to see it come to fruition, to be here shooting in a prohibition state for South by Southwest. And we're talking about cannabis and entheogenic medicine. How amazing is that, right? How far have we come?
Thankfully, we've come leagues, and yet there's still so much territory to cover.
There is a lot of territory to cover. So for you, I mean, I know what inspired me when it came to story, but we'll have more on that later. What I really want to know, because we have you sitting here on the couch, is what first brought you into the world of storytelling? Like, what captured your attention?
You know, it's probably some of those early childhood books, you know, kind of being exposed to stories and narratives, beginnings, middles, ends, and things kind of tying around through the back, and the power of story to move. So yeah, early memories, I certainly remember crying at literature and just really learning through literature. And one day that transitioned into, hey, maybe I want to be a journalist someday, and that's what I did.
You know, that even reminds me, like, I have two kids, and they're in middle school, and I start to think when I watch them grow and learn about my own way of, like, processing information when I was younger. And it reminds me that, you know, when we were little, even learning mathematics at the beginning, the way I first connected to it, and many kids, is through story. So story seems to be, and language, seem to be kind of the first way of us putting together these conscious concepts and communicating them with each other. Like, if you think about it, like story on the cave wall, it really takes us all the way back. How have you seen it kind of influence where we are now, though?
Oh, well, you're right. I mean, you think about before the printing press. How did we communicate? How did we pass down knowledge? And it really was through that storytelling and passing down of information. And of course, it's just changed over the years. And now I think a major element of that, because as we talk about storytelling, inevitably that leads down the pathway of journalism, photojournalism with you, journalism with myself. And, you know, I think a big thing that we're facing right now, a challenge when it comes to story, is understanding media judgment, understanding the quality of media, and almost vetting your media diet. So I do think that's an interesting element today of what some people consider as journalism to be is not journalism. It's propaganda, and what other people pass off as propaganda is actual journalism.
I really love that you're going here because, you know, I mean, it's the first episode, right? And it would be, I would be remiss if I didn't own my own history being a military photojournalist. And a lot of that started with, like, the Vietnam War and a desire to tell the story and share what really happens in war zones, which, you know, we're seeing this play out in real time with Ukrainians now being able to advocate for themselves, right? But on that same note, I'm not gonna lie and hide the fact that I did work for the government, that the Pentagon does consider all of these optics. And that while I'm really happy to say I maintain my integrity, it's not always the case. So we have a lot to learn. But that's something, that's kind of what Highly Informed is all about. It's really about learning from our own mistakes, learning from not even just, you know, they say a smart man learns from his mistakes, a wise man learns from the mistakes of others, right? So I'm trying to learn from everybody, every angle that I can, because I know I'll make plenty of my own mistakes. But if I can get a little bit wise in the process, that would be great. And I think that's kind of why story can become so powerful when it comes to creating change and movement. or inspiring. You know, what we were talking earlier, maybe policy change isn't really, a lot of people think it's data, it's the numbers that usually create the policy change. And while they do support and substantiate the evidence that you need to do it, what inspires change is often story. When it comes to you and your own personal experience of life, like what stories are you diving into? What stories about your heritage or identity are you exploring right now, especially in the field of cannabis?
Oh yeah, you know, so many. I think every day we're living through so many narratives, but you know, one thing that comes to mind is, you know, we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary of Charlotte Figue's death, you know, and Charlotte, the namesake of Charlotte's Web, you know, when she passed away, I remember telling Forbes that, you know, was there ever a more powerful advocate for the plant than her, this little girl who didn't ask to be at the center of this conversation. She just really had a complex form of intractable epilepsy, and the pharmaceuticals weren't helping. And what do you know? Cannabis stopped her seizures, each one of which could have been deadly. She was having 300 seizures a week, and cannabis stopped them entirely. So I think about that, you know, and her going on Sanjay Gupta's show and talking about this, creating change at a scalable level. I always think that's kind of a fascinating place to start. And then, you know, I think all of us are having this modern opportunity to get to know ourselves and our heritage better with all these crazy technological, genealogical advances, right? And so certainly learning in the last decade that thinking that I was born and raised Latino and recognizing that, yeah, that's true, but you are also very much indigenous and of this land on which we exist in Texas and Colorado as well. You know, it certainly changed the way I approached even day-to-day life, but also my work within drug policy reform.
Yeah, when it comes to drug policy reform, it's a really interesting conversation to start to look at the war on drugs, especially, you know, you're a journalist, so I feel like you'll probably have a lot of background information on this. Like, I could ask you anything. But don't worry, I won't surprise you. I'm not trying to trap you. No, but it's like, when it comes to the Latin heritage specifically, or Latin people not being a monolith, and recognizing that we have, like, there is the history of the Spaniard colonization of Latin America, but there's also this rich history of indigenous tribes, and these two things coming together. For me, at least over the last couple years, it's been an interesting subject to kind of play with, right? And there becomes this idea where we share our stories and they're part of our identity, but they're not the definition of our experience. I'm curious to know, like, how your relationship with cannabis has shifted as you've grown into not only your identity, but also your experience.
Yeah, you know, I guess I'm a relatively new consumer.
Yeah.
You know, I think I don't smoke anything successfully because my lungs don't have it. And so I never had that relationship with the plant. And then outside of that, it was always just random edibles my friends were making, and I wasn't willing to roll those dice, and so I just didn't consume until the regulated market came along. Colorado had medical, and suddenly I had a mostly repeatable experience buying products at dispensaries, which really instantly switched overnight, and suddenly cannabis was my preferred substance of choice. So with that happening, I would say that it changed me in profound ways that I would have never expected, without a doubt. You know, recognizing that it made me a better partner and a better entrepreneur and a more thoughtful colleague. So really, when we're talking about every interpersonal dynamic in my life, it changed me for the better. And it's strange to say that, and I wouldn't have thought that would make any sense a decade ago, but that's the way it is. And then certainly my identity and who I am. You know, you and I were talking a few days ago just about some of those interesting elements of being indigenous and being of this land, and taking all of that into consideration as you yourself are experimenting with substances, many of which are in very limited supply in this country and others. And it's as great as it is, as we're seeing this great expansion of the mind and of the self. And we're also seeing a lot of people doing ayahuasca tourism in Peru, and we're seeing people experimenting with peyote when that is not central to their ceremony themselves. They're just looking for the experience. They're looking for that Instagram shot or that blog. And I think we need to be extremely cognizant of that with these substances that are in small supply, and that's where cannabis comes in, because so much of this is really psychoactive. That's the impact that it has on our mind and our body. Cannabis gives us that, and it gives us so much opportunity to explore those realms without depleting resources of peyote and ayahuasca and other more limited plant-based medicines.
Yes, I love this idea. I love this because, when we talk about when you first came to cannabis, right? And you were surprised to find how therapeutic it was, considering the stigma around it, considering what most people think, which is that, you're unproductive, you're kind of hazy. Especially Hollywood really did a thing where they were telling stories about what it meant to be part of a stoner culture or whatever. And that's so interesting that we adopt these stories that are just a glimpse of what it actually is. But when you look at the medicinal properties and you look at cannabis use, it is an entheogenic psychoactive medication, or supplement at least, that people have been using, in project areas, in urban areas, in Black and disenfranchised communities for a long time to treat the trauma of being in those spaces. So it's so amazing to me how it's been stigmatized, though, and now, even because of that stigma, it limits access for people who aren't in those experiences. It just kind of like ripples out to limit everyone's accessibility to the medicine that is really a part of who we are biologically. Like, we all have our own endocannabinoid system, which I am amazed. I love modern technology and science, but I'm always amazed when it's limited by these ideas that we have. Like when we were first making medical discoveries in the Middle Ages, right? We thought, wow, that's really it. We know everything. And you got to bleed out the body to save it, right? And wow, we're just killing everybody. But then we learned, right? And we advanced and we came up with new medical procedures, and we found out, hey, maybe sterilizing the tools could be a good idea. And then we keep progressing and learning. It's so interesting, though, as we keep studying the human body, and even with the pandemic in the last year, all of us learning more about, well, how does my body react to inflammation? How does my body react to, different virus mutations? And really having a conversation about not just how our body reacts to even external factors, but internal factors, like everyone working from home, everyone kind of shifting gears, everyone having time to sit with themselves. And I think that's why cannabis use, we saw it's kind of skyrocket. And cannabis was what? It was
essential.
Essential. That's the word, essential. It's so interesting that it was an essential need, but then at the same time, when we look at the war on drugs, we see what happened with Black and brown communities and it being so essential. And we have this bodily system, an endocannabinoid system, which was why we were talking about medical, that brings it all together. So my question for you is, as you look onto the horizon, and now we're learning more about our endocannabinoid system, that it's a part of our actual body, that it can be something that we can self-regulate with, and it can be something that we can practice sustainability with, and not misappropriation, not the appropriation of sacred medicine to the extent that we're now depleting the Amazon rainforest of the toads that produce, DMT or 5-MeO, bufo. That's a problem. Like when our consciousness comes at the cost of Mother Earth, is it truly conscious? I don't think so, right? This would be consumption. What do you see the future of cannabis being as an entheogenic and psychoactive medicine? Or what's your vision or hope for it?
Well, the future is bright, primarily because we just know nothing about this plant. All of the leading researchers who are working in this space right now agree that we know less than 1% of what there is to know about this plant and how it will help us and how it will benefit us, and also what the risks are to certain communities too. So the future is very bright. One thing I'm speaking on at South by tomorrow is cannabis versus the opioid crisis. So really looking into cannabis and cannabinoids and terpenes as efficacious painkillers. And that's huge. That's so exciting.
Terpenes in isolation.
Absolutely. And everything's more powerful as an entourage, right? So,
absolutely.
And so that's big. And then also part of that conversation is what kind of a role can these chemical components play in weaning people off opioids? And that's just a tiny part of the conversation. But one thing that I like about it is that it just gives us a sliver of an example of how powerful this could be. Because right now, you look at our relationship with chronic pain, and chronic pain already affects, I believe it's 25% of the adults in this country. Comes in many, many shapes and sizes, including inflammation, as you mentioned earlier. That is very much a symptom of chronic pain, and it's a part of it. So here we see cannabinoids and terpenes directly addressing certain types of chronic pain, but also very much helping a lot of these symptoms, a lot of these conditions, like the secondary. So it's helping us sleep, it's reducing our inflammation, and that itself puts this roadblock into this process of a very circular process of chronic pain. And so if cannabis, even if it doesn't have the power, the pain-killing power of an opioid, it still is killing pain, it's still addressing all of these other symptoms and conditions. And when you think about something that affects so many Americans, one out of every 4, I mean, that alone is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
And that's 1 out of every 4 reported. Like when I think of chronic pain, I also think of my friends who are so stubborn, or even parents, older generations, even myself, so stubborn about our pain that you don't go to the doctor because maybe you've been taught, at least I know in a lot of Black and brown communities, you've been taught you can fight through it. You learn to deal with it, you learn to cope, but then it slowly erodes away. At least I've seen, I got certified as a coach somewhere after retirement.
Nice.
And what I saw with a lot of people were experiencing anger and frustration, stress in their life and really difficult relationships. Often chronic pain was involved.
There you go.
Those things are connected, our fight or flight response and our physiology, and also our mental and spiritual physiology, I guess is another way to look at it. It is, even though we can't perceive it, it's still there, just like the endocannabinoid system, right? We didn't perceive it, but it's definitely there because our CB1 and CB2 receptors respond. So this plant is meant to be a part of some of our equation. I think what's really fascinating about it is the unique profiles for each person, though. What have you found for you? Like, as you've explored your relationship with cannabis, have you found yourself to have your own unique formulas that you tend to, or that make you feel particularly good or better?
Yeah, we're only starting to scratch that surface, especially because a lot of these emerging or rare minor cannabinoids are available in such limited supply. We're only starting to see certain ones sneak into the regulated market. That said, I am a huge fan of CBG. I'm loving CBN.
Oh, yeah?
It's great to experiment with that, especially in very strict dosages in the regulated market, products you're buying from legal dispensaries.
And CBN that's really good for insomnia, right? That's the one.
Early evidence showing that, yeah, but that's the
we're
idea.
We're not doctors, we're not giving medical, but yes, this is anecdotal story, which is what this is about.
Yeah.
Actually, let's bring it back to story. When it comes to healthcare, a lot of what we've learned about healthcare, I'm working with Tejas Hemp right now, and we're working on a THCV. We already have it, but we're trying to get the research to prove that it does what we know everyone has already told us it does, through story, through their experience, through their testimony. And that kind of brings me back to a story we were talking about earlier. When you were talking about, before we started recording, sorry you guys, you missed it, but we were talking about in California, how it was the power of medical story that actually started to move the needle when it came to legislation. Can you share that?
Of course, yeah. We're just talking about how cannabis became legal in the first place.
Yeah.
We all know that California is kind of the epicenter for weed in this country, and so much of that is to thank Dennis Perone, who's really the grandfather of regulated cannabis, and may he rest in peace. We lost him in the last few years, but he ultimately was a member of this community in San Francisco. Lots of AIDS patients living with that in the early days, and recognizing that nobody knew why, but having a hit off a bowl suddenly helped all of these secondary conditions that were impacting them.
So AIDS, when we don't even think about it, it's an inflammatory disease. It's an autoimmune inflammatory disease. Now, more people are having, I'm not saying AIDS, but we're seeing more inflammatory disease. Even COVID is an inflammatory virus. It's so interesting to see, like, those cannabinoids. It was the cannabinoids in the bowl reducing the inflammation. Like, that's what we see happening with CBG, CBD, CBN, all the other players in the game, not just THC, although I love old school Mary Jane. But I'm sorry I interrupted. I just got excited. Can you continue?
Yeah, well, that's how he ultimately introduced the first successful medical cannabis law in the world.
Yeah.
And that was Prop 20, 25 years ago back in California, and we're so thankful for him. But you're right, getting back to what an individual experiences is important, because going back to that figure, if we know less than 1% of what there is to know about cannabis as this therapeutic agent for humans and animals and anybody with an ECS, then we recognize that right now the power is in that anecdotal data. But it really doesn't harness true power until we get, peer-reviewed publishings, until we get placebo-controlled clinical trials. That is the gold standard, and that's what we're really, truly looking at. But I was interviewing a couple researchers for this talk I'm giving down here at South by, and they all just say it's extremely hard to fund. Ziva Cooper, one of my friends at UCLA, she's running the UCLA cannabis program down there. And she has a new placebo-controlled clinical trial, and I think it's 4 million, studying specifically the role of terpenes in pain relief. 4 million, but plus you also have to be able to get the okay and the go-ahead from DEA and all these federal agencies, and so research is blockaded. We know that. It's disheartening, it's challenging, and so that is why we rely on these anecdotes. That is why it's so absolutely essential to understand this.
Okay, stop drinking, thank God. It is essential to understand it, because there's so many people who are just going without care. And honestly, to take it back to California, it's interesting to watch how it's playing out, and it's indicative of, like, the health of the industry for sure. I'm excited to see New York come online, because it'll be another performance indicator. But even before we think about performance indicators and we think about the metrics, I go back to, the fact that he was an AIDS patient. And we go back to a lot of our civil liberties and a lot of those fights beginning with AIDS patients, beginning with these disenfranchised communities. Even in New York, when we're talking about civil rights, a lot of musicians who were homosexual or bisexual or experimenting in the streets of New York, when we had, like, the dance clubs, the dance halls, with trans people celebrating life and also going through that struggle of the experience of AIDS and finding that cannabis helped them. Seeing that take root in California is really inspiring. So even though I always knock Cali, because I do, I like to play with Cali a little bit. I lived in New York. I'm from Texas. I lived in New York. I can't help it. New York kind of groomed me to be this way, but also Texas, because low-key California and Texas, we have a thing for some reason. But y'all can't stop moving here. But I have to pay respect, because it's like a heritage that we have to honor and we have to be mindful of, especially as we continue to develop the industry to help disenfranchised communities and create an equitable space. For you, as you reconnected to your indigenous heritage, what did that awaken in you when it came to the call for creating equity in the industry and a new way of approaching capitalism in cannabis?
It definitely affirmed everything that I already knew, but I would say that it lit a brighter fire within me, recognizing that I have this blood of this disadvantaged population that has truly just been treated terribly at every turn in this country's history, and recognizing that if you have any power whatsoever, you have to use that power for good. And so, yeah, last year, about a year and a half ago, my colleague and I, we created the Grasslands Diversity and Marketing Internship. And what that all that does is it creates opportunity for people who identify as some sort of underrepresented population. It's been so ideal to be able to hop into these conversations and create opportunities for people of color, and people from other communities that aren't generally represented in cannabis or marketing. And already it's been really successful in transforming the face of our agency, of marketing in general, of cannabis in general. I can only control my little part of the world, of course. And yet at the same time, we're just trying to do our best to make sure that we are creating an environment that prioritizes DE&I, that very much prioritizes remembering to put the indigenous back into BIPOC. Because I think lots of important conversations have been happening over the last few years. They're long overdue, and we're not doing enough. And yet we also need to recognize that the indigenous communities are also a part of this conversation that we're now finally starting to have. So it lit that fire much more brightly.
I love this. All right, diversity at Grasslands. You know, I'm excited because this season we have we have Vlad Batista from Happy Monkey coming on, and he talked a lot about building from the grassroots in the streets of New York. And then we have Kelly Perez from Cannabis Doing Good, and that's a big part of her focus. But yeah, I also talked to Christine De La Rosa and Frederica Easley, and we had this incredible conversation about how a rising tide raises all ships, and how these diversity initiatives, it's really not just about having numbers or tokenism. It's about creating the opportunity for an exploration of new ideas, which we've never done before. So I want to thank you so much for your time, Ricardo. This has been really great. Before we go, let's see, we're going to close the show, and this is broadcasting on 420.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes, so let's see. In celebration of 420, what is your greatest wish for cannabis this year?
Yeah, I always like to talk attainable goals, right? Because, what's the point? We should be dreaming big, but at the same time, it should be attainable. So if we're talking about 2022, I would just like to start seeing an elevated consciousness among people who are in positions of power, people who are decision makers in any organization. And I just would like to see them taking ownership and enacting change to start working towards some of these goals that can't happen without that buy-in. Because if I can do something at Grasslands, marketing agency, which has 26 full-time people, imagine what you could do with a small dispensary or grow group that employs 200 or 300. Or an MSO that has tens of thousands of employees. I mean, it is our individual responsibility to be better. One, if you're an entrepreneur, just do better generally. But if you're an entrepreneur in cannabis, you have a responsibility. And I am generally unimpressed with what I'm seeing out there. And so I just like to see movement. I'd like to see progress. They need to give a shit. They need to wake up to the reality in which we live and be better and do something and start making that change inside their four walls.
I love that, Ricardo. All right, our wish for 2022, we're calling you out to call you in.
Yes.
We're bringing entheogenic storytelling to the forefront. We're gonna have real conversations, develop some real self-awareness and consciousness within the cannabis and psychedelics community. Thank you so much, Ricardo. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Shaun.
This was exciting. I can't believe we could do this. When it launches on 420, I'm definitely gonna go smokable, but thank you all so much for joining me for this premiere episode of Highly Informed with Ricardo Baca, where we got to discuss entheogenic storytelling. I'm Shaun Salvaje. I can't tell you enough how grateful I am for this, and can't wait to see you in future episodes. Let's see, y'all stay elevated and stay highly informed. Thank you.
Can you
You
just-
might want